quiero partir dando en inicio a nuestra jornada con las palabras del rector Ignacio Sánchez, rector de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias, profesora Méndez, por esta apertura de este seminario y ceremonia inaugural. Muchas gracias, señora ministra, secretaria general de Gobierno, Camila Vallejos, por estar hoy día con nosotros. Un saludo muy especial a la rectora de la Universidad de Chile y a la directora del Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, la profesora María Luisa Méndez, a nuestra conferencista Leslie McCall, y me sumo a todos los vocativos ya mencionados con las autoridades de municipalidades, autoridades universitarias, autoridades de gobierno y todos quienes hoy día se convocan acá. Sin duda es un motivo de gran alegría reunirnos esta mañana para dar inicio a la 10ª Conferencia Internacional COES en el marco de la celebración de los 10 años de trabajo del Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, que tantos frutos ha dado para nuestro país, para nuestro sistema universitario y para la sociedad. Este año, estos 10 años desde que se creara el centro, marca un periodo en que ha realizado una destacadísima labor en la generación de investigación científica de punta, en la formación de personas, un capital humano muy avanzado y un relevante aporte al desarrollo de las políticas públicas. Estamos muy contentos de formar parte de este centro junto a la Universidad de Chile, con la colaboración de la Universidad Diego Portales y la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. Chile y Latinoamérica sin duda han experimentado grandes transformaciones en términos de cohesión y conflicto social en los últimos años. Nuestra convivencia se ha vuelto un desafío. Hemos sido también testigos de cómo la cohesión social se ha visto impactada por las brechas sociales y culturales, la pérdida de confianza en las instituciones, la política, la segregación social y la crisis económica y sanitaria. También han habido temas de multiculturalidad, de migración, que han influido en nuestra cohesión social. Precisamos sí que cuanto más multicultural e inclusiva es una sociedad, una nación, mayor debiera ser esa cohesión social y ese es un desafío a cumplir. Siguiendo los objetivos del centro en cuanto a contribuir al mejoramiento de la cohesión social a través de múltiples investigaciones que nutran las políticas públicas y el diálogo social, en este congreso se van a analizar cambios observados y se intentará definir a la luz del intercambio de experiencias cómo poder seguir aportando al desarrollo de una política pública futura. Así también cómo se intentarán identificar herramientas con las que se dispone desde la comunidad científica para aprender de dichas transformaciones y para poder entregar ciertas claves o apoyo a la sociedad. Para ello, este congreso contempla nada menos que 24 mesas de ponencias de académicos y académicas nacionales e internacionales, charlas magistrales a cargo de destacados invitados, como por ejemplo la profesora Silvia Cataldi, profesora asociada de Sociología del Departamento de Desarrollo y Procesos de Socialización de la Universidad Sapienza de Roma, Leslie McCall, socióloga y politóloga norteamericana, académica del City University of New York, y Agnes Van Santen, socióloga y directora del Centro Nacional de Investigación Científica de Francia. Junto a esto, importantes mesas de diálogo académico y también social. No quisiera terminar estas breves palabras sin antes destacar el rol que cumple el Centro de Estudios de Conflicto Social como articulador del conocimiento científico para desde allí comprender el fenómeno del conflicto y la cohesión social. Ser así un aporte por medio de la ciencia abierta a este debate público y a la toma de decisiones de políticas públicas. Un trabajo que sin duda está orientado principalmente a mejorar la calidad de vida de las personas, objetivo que subyace a nuestra misión como Universidad de Compromiso Público. También compartir la alegría de saber que ha sido otorgado el proyecto Puente por 2 años de renovación del financiamiento de COES para hacer una postulación exitosa el próximo año. Cierro estas palabras felicitando a COES, a todo su gran equipo de trabajo por este muy importante congreso, pero también agradezco esta instancia a FONDAP por el permanente apoyo que ha hecho posible el gran aporte de este centro al país y a la región. Muchas gracias al Ministerio de Ciencia, a ANID, por el apoyo que hemos recibido. Muy bienvenidos a esta actividad.
Muchísimas gracias, rector, por sus palabras. Entonces, continuando con esta ceremonia inaugural, vamos a dar la palabra a la rectora Rosa de Bes para la bienvenida de parte de la Universidad de Chile.
No los veo, pero los saludo. Muy buenos días a todas y todos, muy especialmente a la señora ministra Camila Vallejo, al rector de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, doctor Ignacio Sánchez, a nuestro querido alcalde Claudio Castro, a Patricio Oveja, el presidente del directorio de la Asociación Chilena de Pro Naciones Unidas, a la directora del Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, María Luisa Méndez, a la profesora Leslie McCall, directora asociada de Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. Muchas gracias por visitarnos y estar acá. A todas las autoridades universitarias, investigadores, especialmente investigadoras, y a la comunidad universitaria en general. Es una gran alegría celebrar los 10 años del Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social. Para la Universidad de Chile este centro representa un orgullo, pues las investigaciones acá realizadas no solo han permitido comprender mejor nuestra sociedad, sino que además han impactado la formulación de políticas públicas y la discusión sobre los grandes temas país. Esta incidencia en el debate académico y social muestra la solidez y la influencia del COES. Felicitamos a sus equipos de investigadores e investigadoras, a su directora, María Luisa Méndez, y a su primer director y actual subdirector, el profesor Dante Contreras. Estudiar la sociedad es un desafío complejo, sobre todo cuando observamos una ciudadanía cada vez más crítica y menos predecible. La única posibilidad de realizar ese examen con rigurosidad es a través del enfoque inter- y transdisciplinario que también caracteriza al COES. La multiplicidad de disciplinas, perspectivas teóricas y encuadres metodológicos que se encuentran en este centro permiten una aproximación empírica de excelencia a los fenómenos que median los conflictos sociales. También es muy valiosa la colaboración interinstitucional que se practica en el COES, pues ya no es posible producir conocimiento de frontera de manera aislada. Es destacable también su capacidad formadora, que contribuye con sus programas de postdoctorado e incorporación de investigadores e investigadoras jóvenes a la ampliación de la academia en Chile. Sabemos que sus talleres y charlas para los nuevos y nuevas académicas son una actividad imperdible para quienes se están insertando en las universidades nacionales. Existen numerosos testimonios del enorme valor formativo del COES que se proyecta de esta manera hacia varias instituciones de educación superior. El comportamiento político de las personas, la formación de actitudes y preferencias, las desigualdades socioeconómicas y de género, o el rol de la historia y la memoria, entre otros temas relevantes, tienen un lugar destacado en la producción de conocimiento que han realizado durante esta década de funcionamiento. Esas investigaciones han permitido conocer mejor nuestro país y a su gente. Las preguntas que han orientado esos estudios han sido siempre pertinentes para entender las formas que adopta el conflicto social y cómo es posible gestionar la cohesión social en tiempos políticos polarizados. El COES surgió después de un ciclo de movilizaciones que remeció al país y mostró las dificultades que existen en nuestra sociedad para reconocer y atender las demandas sociales. En estos años hemos observado una intensificación de esos conflictos, que tuvo su punto más significativo en la revuelta social de octubre de 2019. La redacción de una nueva constitución parecía ser la respuesta institucional a la crisis, pero estos 4 años de ardua discusión política nos han mostrado la complejidad para alcanzar acuerdos mayoritarios en la población. Existe un déficit de diálogo para procesar nuestras diferencias que afecta también el fortalecimiento de la democracia. Durante este año, coordinamos junto a la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile la participación ciudadana para el proceso constitucional recientemente finalizado. Una de las tantas lecciones que obtuvimos de este trabajo, que convocó a 270.000 personas, es que existe una aspiración compartida por hacer de Chile un país más justo y equitativo, y que las personas requieren ser escuchadas. Trabajar para alcanzar mayores niveles de igualdad y participación ciudadana es sin duda un aporte a la cohesión social. A ese objetivo también contribuye la labor que realiza el COES, que con evidencia rigurosa nos ha mostrado durante una década las complejidades del conflicto social. Reciban, en nombre de la Universidad de Chile, un profundo agradecimiento por aquella tarea y cuenten con nuestro apoyo en los desafíos académicos futuros. Muchas gracias a todas y todos.
Muchísimas gracias por sus palabras, rectora. Y a continuación, entonces, vamos a invitar a la ministra Camila Vallejos para que nos dé sus palabras en esta ceremonia inaugural. Muchas gracias.
Realmente no se ven. Bueno, siento que extraño hablar así, sin poder verlos a cara. Perdón que estoy un poco con alergia, resfrío, no sé si a todos les ha pasado estos meses. Uno no sabe en qué está, si con COVID permanente o alergia. No estoy con COVID, así que tranquilo. Bueno, buenos días a todos y a todas. Evidentemente para nosotros es un honor poder representar, lo conversamos con nuestro equipo que nos tocó preparar estas palabras en esta instancia y no es un honor representar al gobierno del presidente Gabriel Boric en esta conferencia internacional del Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social COES, que además desde hace 10 años, ya pasa muy rápido el tiempo, ha iniciado su trabajo y ha sido un núcleo muy importante, muy relevante para el estudio, la discusión y la reflexión en temas que nos importan como país diariamente, no solamente en los momentos de estallidos, de movilizaciones o de tensiones políticas, sociales, ¿no? Quiero agradecer evidentemente a la rectora Rosa Deves, al rector Ignacio Sánchez, que son los dueños de casa en este evento. Agradecer también a los directores, directoras, a los asociados, asociadas, y que nos recuerdan obviamente las reflexiones que desde nuestra mirada como gobierno son cruciales para Chile y cruciales en estos momentos. A 10 años de su establecimiento, el COES se ha hecho cargo de investigar y discutir un tema tan complejo como la cohesión y el conflicto social en Chile. Uno piensa qué es lo que genera la cohesión para avanzar y qué es lo que detona el conflicto. Conflicto y cohesión social son importantes para mover una sociedad, permiten el movimiento constante, pero entender qué está detrás de lo que gatilla el conflicto o qué es lo que permite o cuáles son las razones que habilitan la cohesión social no es fácil de determinar y resolver. Y este trabajo permite, obviamente, ampliar la discusión en nuestro país, pero también a nivel internacional. Es decir, cómo estos debates, estas reflexiones también permean los debates que son globales y que al final nos permiten juntar realidades distintas, idiosincrasias distintas, trayectorias políticas distintas, pero en torno a la interpretación de fenómenos que nos están impactando independiente de las fronteras. Estudiar la cohesión social obviamente no es arbitrario, le subyace el deseo y la convicción de contribuir con respuestas a la pregunta de la vida en sociedad, de cómo convivimos en sociedad, cómo establecemos nuestra vida en común. Y este trabajo, por lo tanto, ha sido clave para entender, por ejemplo, el debate en torno al estallido social y el proceso constituyente, el énfasis en la mirada territorial, la complejidad del fenómeno de la violencia. Estoy pensando solo en algunos de los muchos temas que hemos visto en publicaciones e instancias de debate como esta conferencia o las publicaciones de los medios, los debates en el Congreso y que terminan siendo de interés público, político, ciudadano y social. Los recientes procesos de nuestra sociedad, sin ir más lejos, son hoy más comprensibles también gracias al aporte que ustedes han hecho sostenidamente en instancias no solo académicas, sino que también ciudadanas. Como gobierno, pero también como país, necesitamos y agradecemos esta mirada comprensiva, analítica y docente que colabora en la calidad del debate y que ha sido importante en la elaboración de políticas sociales, de comités de expertos y que convive con el debate político día a día. Y quiero destacar eso, porque esto no son solamente debates, reflexiones, estudios, publicaciones que se quedan encapsulados en la academia, sino que también se ponen a disposición del debate de políticas públicas a través de sus expertos y expertas y están permanentemente dialogando, interactuando con aquellos espacios donde se toman decisiones políticas para el país. Porque quizás no sepamos que pase en los próximos 10 años, qué nuevos fenómenos sociales surgirán, como está la dinámica, hasta Bad Bunny hoy día está enojado por la inteligencia artificial. Pero sí tenemos claro que conjugando el saber académico y la investigación con la acción oportuna de las políticas públicas, podemos enfrentar de mejor manera los inmensos desafíos que se vienen por delante. Es decir, nos dan cierta certeza y seguridad de que aunque no sepamos lo que viene en 10 años, podemos a través de trabajo en conjunto enfrentar de mejor manera los desafíos y las dinámicas de los procesos cambiantes. Este es el espíritu detrás de esta conferencia que se ha consolidado como un espacio único para que nuestras instituciones de educación superior, públicas y privadas, creen lazos y compartan los resultados de sus trabajos. Un esfuerzo que posiciona a nuestro país como un polo de investigación con capital humano avanzado, con aportes concretos en Chile y en el mundo. Es por ello que tenemos que seguir valorando instancias como esta, y como gobierno lo estamos haciendo y lo seguiremos haciendo. Seguir apoyándolas, porque nos aportan una mirada interdisciplinaria, una mirada crítica, en temas fundamentales como las persistentes desigualdades en materias de género, asuntos indígenas, territoriales, cohesión social y las políticas públicas para enfrentarlas. Pero también porque nos provocan, nos llaman a la acción, nos muestran nuevos caminos, nuevas posibilidades, pensar fuera de la caja. ¿Cómo transformar nuestras sociedades? Entendiendo que esos cambios solo son posibles desde un esfuerzo transversal, colectivo, de los distintos actores políticos y sociales que conviven en nuestro territorio. Como gobierno miramos con atención, por ejemplo, la mesa que se desarrollará sobre memoria, conflicto y cambio social. La mesa sobre las nuevas dimensiones y perspectivas sobre las desigualdades económicas. Y el panel sobre conflictos medioambientales y crecimientos, entre otros. Todos temas muy fundamentales para el desarrollo de nuestro país y que son temas donde permanentemente tenemos que enfrentarnos a la capacidad de decidir y tomar definiciones. ¿Para qué hablar del modelo de desarrollo sostenible y cómo este permanentemente se enfrenta al conflicto de los derechos laborales de las y los trabajadores? La demanda de empleo. Para mí, como geógrafa, y quiero decirlo, valoro tremendamente el aporte en la línea de investigación sobre geografías del conflicto y la cohesión, donde estudios que abordan consecuencias concretas de la estigmatización territorial son un aporte para el cómo entendemos, desarrollamos y diseñamos mejores ciudades, mejores territorios, más integrales. Creo firmemente que nuestro país tiene la capacidad de seguir haciendo investigación de calidad en las diferentes áreas, pero particularmente en las ciencias sociales. Dicho esto, y ustedes lo saben mejor que yo, las discusiones y propuestas que hay que materializar para la transformación social son claves. Es decir, que las propuestas no queden en publicaciones, sino que permitan habilitar cambios, para que los cambios ocurran. Y ahí es donde la pelota pasa a nuestra cancha, evidentemente, pero también la de ustedes, pero principalmente la nuestra. Como gobierno hemos asumido con convicción y confianza las posibilidades que tenemos de impulsar una mejor democracia. Es difícil, pero no es imposible. Donde en esta democracia se respeten los derechos fundamentales, donde se releve la dignidad y la igualdad, donde se subsanen deudas pendientes hace años, por no decir décadas. Desde el primer día, entonces, trabajamos con un objetivo claro: avanzar hacia un Estado que garantice los derechos de todas y todos, porque entendemos que es la condición base para alcanzar la cohesión social. Este es nuestro futuro y nuestro horizonte. Trabajamos para que las personas tengan una pensión justa, lo básico, que se les reconozca sus años de trabajo, para que el acceso a la salud sea equitativo y oportuno, de calidad, para que por fin las personas que realizan cuidados sean reconocidas y apoyadas por el Estado, para que tengamos un pacto fiscal que financie las políticas que chilenos y chilenas necesitan. Trabajamos también para fortalecer lo público y lo colectivo, las organizaciones de base, las juntas de vecinos, sus capacidades, su empoderamiento, porque es así donde hacemos crecer la verdadera fuerza del cambio y la transformación. Sin duda hemos aprendido que esto se debe construir desde los territorios, participativamente y en escucha activa, permanente, saber escuchar. Así fue como surgieron y como seguiremos impulsando políticas públicas tan importantes como las 40 horas, la reducción de la jornada laboral, el Registro Nacional de Deudores de Alimentos o el Plan de Emergencia Habitacional. Y es así como estamos avanzando hacia una transición socioecológica justa, donde, por ejemplo, en Tocopilla ya se inició un proceso participativo y multisectorial, gobierno, privados, universidades y sociedad civil, donde se quiere potenciar la visión de los tocopillanos para su ciudad, donde además de recuperación social se avanza hacia el país que queremos, con una matriz productiva innovadora y sustentable, porque es difícil hablar de cómo avanzar en derechos si no hablamos de desarrollo económico y crecimiento económico, y que incluya más la reconversión de trabajos, generando más y mejor empleo, dándoles posibilidades materiales de desarrollo también a las familias trabajadoras. Así lo estamos haciendo también en el Salar de Maricunga, en Atacama, donde se producirá litio, y en el que se ha incluido a la comunidad indígena Coya de la comuna de Diego de Almagro, porque sabemos que este proceso de diálogo es esencial para elaborar la responsabilidad de avanzar de manera sostenible en la Estrategia Nacional del Litio. La Estrategia Nacional del Litio no se sostiene solo con las empresas y los inversores, también se sostiene con las comunidades, con los pueblos originarios y con las autoridades locales. Sin la mirada económica, ambiental y social no hay estrategia integral posible. Este es un trabajo inédito en el país, pero es el Chile que queremos, donde todos seamos incluidos en nuestro proceso de desarrollo, que sea justo, inclusivo, democrático, paritario y respetuoso. Son este tipo de programas, es esta forma de hacer política desde los territorios y con las personas, cómo estamos trabajando para avanzar hacia un Chile de derechos, hacia una democracia más consolidada, amplia y participativa, hacia una democracia donde el horizonte sea de certidumbre, sea un horizonte deseado y nos permita fomentar la cohesión social, porque es un horizonte que aspiramos todos y todas de manera colectiva. Amigas, amigos, estimados y estimadas, en un mundo globalizado y acelerado como en el que vivimos, donde nos enfrentamos a nuevos desafíos en las comunicaciones, en el acceso a la información, en donde nuestros derechos se ven amenazados por situaciones que parecían del futuro hace unos años, debemos continuar valorando estos espacios de discusión. Hoy celebramos 10 años de una conferencia que ha traído discusión de alto nivel a nuestro país. Un esfuerzo que valoramos, promovemos y que seguiremos promoviendo. Desde este gobierno miramos con atención el proceso de construcción de múltiples perspectivas, porque lo entendemos como un aporte fundamental para el progreso de un Chile que está cambiando velozmente, diariamente, cotidianamente. Y en este vértigo de cambios acelerados, qué bien nos hacen estos espacios que permitan detenernos un poco, entender, mirarnos, reflexionar en conjunto y construir colectivamente lo que queremos, no solo para el día siguiente, cómo quedamos en ese lugar del mañana inmediato, sino cómo construimos conjuntamente el futuro que deseamos para nosotros, para nuestros hijos y para nuestros nietos. Que nos invitan a creer que además es posible, que nada está perdido, muy por el contrario, está todo en nuestras manos. Hoy estamos avanzando en cuáles serán los caminos que tomará nuestra sociedad y nuestro país en la década que viene, en las décadas que vienen, desde el estudio del conflicto y la cohesión como una dialéctica permanente. Avanzamos como aliados en reforzar esa mirada y construir juntos el Chile que queremos, que deseamos, que necesitamos y que merecemos. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Muchísimas gracias, ministra, por sus palabras y por mostrarnos los enormes desafíos de la investigación académica con un horizonte de bienestar para las personas, las comunidades y nuestro país. Queremos agradecer, por supuesto, la presencia de la rectora, del rector y de nuestras autoridades, y con esto damos por finalizada esta parte de la ceremonia inaugural de la 10ª Conferencia Internacional COES, titulada La Gran Transformación, Pasado, Presente y Futuro del Conflicto y la Cohesión Social. Entonces, continuando con el programa de hoy, queremos dejar con ustedes a la profesora Leslie McCall, socióloga y politóloga estadounidense, quien también nos acompañó, si ustedes recuerdan, en nuestra primera conferencia hace ya 10 años. Leslie McCall es profesora presidencial en The Graduate Center, directora asociada del Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality y académica senior del LIS. Dentro de sus áreas de interés destacan la desigualdad social, la sociología económica y política y la teoría y métodos sociales. Hoy realizará una charla magistral titulada The Multidimensional Politics of Economic Inequality in the U.S. and in Comparative Perspective. Entonces, damos la palabra a la profesora Leslie McCall.
Muchas gracias. I apologize for my American accent and for my lack of Spanish. It's such a great honor to be here. I'm very humbled by the presence of such esteemed scholars and representatives of the government. I am not 100% sure where my presentation is. Let me just step away for 1 minute to try to find out how this is going to work. Apologies. I thought that the presentation would be here already, and I don't have my computer with me. I do have the presentation on a jump drive. So we're working this out, so just 1 minute.
Les pedimos disculpas, estamos resolviendo esta falla técnica, este tipo de conflictos, y gracias por su atenta espera y actitud de cohesión. Muchas gracias. Okay, let's see.
Okay, I think we've got it all sorted out. I am going to have to indicate when to change the slides, so apologies for that. And I am going to speak for hopefully about 40 minutes. And I'm really looking forward to comments and questions during the discussion period. So first, let me just also say, in addition to being honored and humbled in the presence of so many esteemed people here, I also want to thank COES especially and congratulate them on this 10th anniversary, especially Professor Castillo, who has been so helpful to me in introducing me to COES and also to the politics of inequality in Chile. I've learned an enormous amount about the US from my understanding of Chile. And so today I'm going to, in addition to learning about Chile itself, I am a specialist on the US politics, and hopefully the work that I'm doing on the US and within comparative perspective is also helpful in understanding the politics of inequality in other countries. But certainly my understanding of the US case has been increased tremendously by my familiarity and understanding of the Chilean case. Okay, so let's get started with the first slide. Okay. Multidimensionality is in the title of the talk, and it can mean something different to different people. The way I'm using it is threefold. The first way is pretty standard, and that is to demarcate among these three different spheres. So, for example, you study political inequalities within the political sphere, lack of political representation that we'd heard about earlier, lack of political voice or equality in political voice and participation. So those are inequalities in the political sphere, and I'm going to end with the importance of the political sphere. I'm going to then, in the beginning, talk more about the economic and the social spheres, but leave for the end what I think to be the most important sphere, which is the political sphere. And my thinking about this has evolved over time. I've been here before, and I've had the great privilege and honor to be here before, but my thinking on this has evolved over time, particularly in the last 5 years since my last visit here. So we'll end on the political sphere, but the political sphere is also demarcated from the social and the economic sphere being the sphere in which we often talk about economic inequality, high levels of economic inequality rising in the US, declining or stable in Chile, but nonetheless in both countries very high levels of economic inequality. And then, of course, there's the social sphere. Often the inequalities related to gender and race and ethnicity, national status, indigenous status, sexuality. These sorts of inequalities are often discussed under the category of the social. The second and third ways that I'm talking about multidimensionality are a little bit different. So in the second way that I talk about multidimensionality, it's very much related to this idea of conflict and cohesion. So most of the time, people talk about a conflict between addressing issues of class inequality and addressing issues of gender or racial or these social status-related inequalities. So if you address one, then that means that you're not paying attention to the other. They're separate from each other and oftentimes seen as in tension or in conflict with each other. People who are interested in addressing class inequality may not be interested in addressing racial and gender inequality. But in this second way of talking about multidimensionality, I'm actually interested in understanding the integration of these two fields, and specifically not separating out the social, the gender and racial and ethnic inequalities from the economic. Usually they're kind of separated, certainly in the discussion of politics of inequality, and I don't mean at all to minimize the divisions that exist among race, gender, and class, and political orientations towards those. But what I'm going to be doing today is trying to, at least in the first part of the talk, trying to understand economic inequality from an integrated class, race, and gender perspective that potentially could lead to more cohesion among social and economic groups. Okay, and then finally, the third way I think about multidimensionality is in terms of the multiple dimensions within each of these spheres. So, for example, within the social sphere, we do talk about gender and racial and ethnic inequality in the economy, but then there are also some non-economic forms of social inequality along these lines. Reproductive rights, for example, although it has a very strong economic dimension to it, it can also be seen as not fundamentally about economic issues. And then similarly, within the economic sphere, we talk about redistribution in order to reduce economic inequality, but then we kind of assume that there's just one way to reduce economic inequality, and that's through government redistribution. So I like to think about multiple ways, multiple dimensions along which we can reduce even economic inequality when we're staying within the economic sphere. I'm going to focus specifically on market-oriented inequalities. That's not to say that the government redistribution is not important, in fact vital, but overlooked in the discussion of the politics of inequality is our desires and public desires for greater equality and justice within the economic and market sphere. So I'm going to focus on that in the second part of my talk. Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. All right, so to introduce or to provide a little bit of background for the research that I'm going to present, I thought it would be helpful to begin with this general proposition, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There are a lot of ideas in this proposition, this very short statement, that are related to ideologies that are considered core to American culture and American norms, but I think are also spread more widely across the world to varying extents. But these different ideologies are melded together and often conflated together in a statement such as this one. So let me just read it, and then I'll talk about what these ideologies are. So Americans believe that everyone has an equal chance to rise through hard work, and as a result, individuals are responsible for their own destinies, market outcomes are fair, and government redistribution is unnecessary. So what you have here, particularly in the beginning, Americans believe that everyone has an equal chance to rise through hard work. That is the American dream ideology. As a result, individuals are responsible for their own destinies. That's individualism, individual responsibility for where one ends up economically in terms of their economic status. Market outcomes are fair. I'm going to call that free market ideology. And government redistribution is unnecessary. That's anti-government ideology. So you see the workings of these various ideologies all melded and I think conflated together in this statement that is also used to justify high levels of economic inequality. So therefore, it's the American public that's responsible because they believe in this ideology and then do not support government redistribution. So what I've been trying to do over the past 20 years, really, with many, many collaborators, is to unpack the statement, to parse it out, the various elements, and to see how much support, empirical support there is for each of these elements, and also to better understand the relationship among these different elements so that they're not conflated. Today I'm going to focus on two ideologies. One is the ideology of the level playing field. This is very much related to the idea that everyone has an equal chance to rise through hard work, regardless, that is, of one's class background, one's gender, one's race or ethnicity or national status or sexuality. That is what I'm going to call a level playing field ideology. And then I'm also going to talk about free market ideology. So those are the two ideologies that are part of this kind of mega ideology that I'm going to focus on today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so very specifically, what I'm going to be doing is talking about, so there are two parts to the empirical work that I'm going to present. The first part has to do with the relationship between inequality and opportunity, and then the second part has to do with egalitarian public policy. Particularly, I'm going to be looking at policy preferences. So the idea in the first part is that we are trying to reverse the causal arrow that was indicated in the previous proposition. So the proposition goes that people believe that there's equal opportunity for all, right? Because people believe in equal opportunity, a level playing field, therefore outcomes are fair. What we're doing in this opportunity model of beliefs about inequality and redistribution is reversing the causal arrow and saying that inequality itself, high levels of economic inequality, will result in people's skepticism about the existence of equality of opportunity. So we take inequality, income inequality of outcomes as the causal agent here in reducing people's confidence in the existence of equal opportunity. And when I talk about opportunity, I am talking about what I think most people define as opportunity or economic opportunity, and that is access to education and good jobs. Sometimes we call this a shared prosperity or inclusive growth, in addition to equal educational access. So our hypothesis, I'm going to talk first about the hypothesis one. Our hypothesis one is that high levels of economic inequality, I just mentioned this, reduces perceptions of equal opportunity and increases perceptions of structural barriers along multiple dimensions. So what's key here is that we're not only suggesting that people create or are aware of certain barriers towards economic opportunity as a result of high levels of economic inequality, but our hypothesis is that these perceptions will hold across social groups. This is where I'm integrating the social and the economic. So specifically, we're going to be looking at perceptions of economic opportunity for class groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, and gender groups. And that's the part of this, this first part that we're working on now and that has not been published. The traditional H1T is the traditional hypothesis, which is that, again, this is something I'm sure you're very familiar with, which is that inequality is supposed to motivate people to work hard and to reap the rewards of an unequal society that is in high compensation. So people value inequality, and inequality makes them work harder so that then they can gain the economic success that's available in a highly unequal society. The other thing that the traditional hypothesis suggests is that there is a level playing field, that people believe that everyone has an equal chance to rise, regardless of their class background, their racial background, their ethnicity, or their gender. So that's on the one hand, but interestingly, as you all know, those of you who study polarization, conflict, and cohesion, there's another side of this view, kind of conventional, traditional view, which is that economic inequality breeds division and conflict between racial and ethnic groups, between social groups and class groups. So not only between the rich and poor, but between groups that are differentiated by race, ethnicity, and gender as well. Again, our hypothesis is counter to that we might see grounds for connectedness and potentially solidarity as a result of high levels of economic inequality. Okay, so I'm going to just be very brief about the second part. Then in the second part, I will talk about policy preferences related to economic opportunity. A lot of my work in the past has focused on education, which I know is really important here in Chile too, access to affordable and high quality education. Today, I'm going to focus on what I see as desires for economic justice in the marketplace, in the workplace, as opposed to, or in addition to, support for government redistribution. Okay, I think we can move on. I'm going to check. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a minute on this. Most of the data comes from sources that many people here are probably familiar with. They're international social surveys, but then some of the data is also going to come from surveys that we collected ourselves and fielded ourselves in the US that involve survey experiments. I'm going to be drawing on a lot of different data sets that I will put in the, you'll see it in the title, the data source, but I'm not going to talk about the individual data sources because I'm drawing from about 10 different data sets in this talk. I'm going to be presenting very straightforward bar graphs mostly, descriptive data, but the conclusions that I'm drawing are based on more rigorous research in which I'm controlling for a number of different factors. And then finally, let me just acknowledge that I have a number of collaborators, and I will be referencing them in the lower left corner through various citations. Okay, so let's jump into the first part. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a set of survey experiments that we've been doing, one of which was published already, but the research I'm going to show you today draws a little bit from that, but also a number of studies that we've conducted since then to extend this opportunity model of beliefs about inequality. So the treatment is information about rising economic inequality in the United States. It's very straightforward. We call it a weak treatment because we are not in any way trying to draw people in with personal stories or personalized information about where they stand in the income distribution and that sort of thing. So we consider it weak. We're just giving people information that's taken from a government report, a bipartisan, non-political, nonpartisan report of the US government. And we don't mention anything about economic opportunity. It's only about inequalities and economic outcomes, that is income. We don't mention anything about economic opportunity, such as education or jobs. We don't mention anything about gender or race. So there's no overlap between the information we give people on economic inequality and the questions that we ask them about economic opportunity along class, race, and gender lines. And then the control article is in a similar format, but it uses statistics from American baseball. So if you want to jump ahead to the next slide, I'm going to have to come back to this slide. Okay, so there's an article, but this is the graph accompanying the treatment, and it just shows the growth in income inequality over a 35-year period. And you can see, of course, the great increase in the concentration of income, or the growth in income for the top 1%. And so in the article, relative to the rest of the distribution, in the article just describes in words what you see in this graph. And then the next graph, this is just the control. So you see something very similar. These are baseball statistics, and the article just goes through. If you jump back to the previous graph, this information, I just want to note that it's also weak because you can see that there's actually income growth across the distribution. So we're not giving people a completely pessimistic scenario. We're saying that there has been growth across the distribution, but it's just been concentrated at a much greater level at the top of the distribution. Okay, so if we jump back up, there we go. So our main outcome variables, I'm not going to talk about the redistribution part. I'm only going to talk about the opportunity part. And so our main outcome variables are from a survey, the International Social Survey Program, which is the preeminent international survey on attitudes about inequality. So these, even though we're conducting the survey experiment in the US ourselves, we constructed the survey, we're taking these items from the International Social Survey Program. Some of you might be familiar with these items, and I'm going to talk about how we've tried to improve, what the problems with those items are, and how we've tried to improve upon them. So we have a measure of individualism, which is the importance of hard work and ambition in getting ahead, and also the idea that everyone should be able to make it and have opportunities to get ahead regardless of their background, gender, race, or class background. I'm going to call that the level playing field. And then structuralism, we have indicators of how important class and racial and ethnic group status is. And those are going to be views that represent a more structuralist orientation. Okay, so I think we can jump ahead 2 slides. Great. So this is these are the questions that we're using, but I wanted to show you the data so this data is actually coming from the International Social Survey Program, so we have this data for 29 countries, this survey was fielded in 2019, I think in 2019 in Chile, but over the period from 2019 to 2021 across these various countries. In the US, for example, it was fielded during COVID. So in some of these countries, you're going to see COVID effects. In some of these countries, you're not, but I don't have time to talk about that. Okay, so here are the individualistic orientations on the left, which is how important do you think hard work is? And then the more structural answers or barriers to opportunity, such as having educated parents, coming from a wealthy family, and knowing the right people. Those are the 3 groups of columns that are on the right-hand side of the graph. And what you see here is something that is both widely understood and known, but also some results that are not very widely understood and known. And that is that when you look at the US, that's the blue bar, the dark blue bar, they are more likely than similar countries in the gray bar, similar rich countries, high-income countries are represented, the median in the gray bar. And then in the light blue bar is a survey of the top 1% in the US, just in the Chicago area. I don't have time to talk about that, but I'm happy to talk more about it later. But what you see is the most common result is that Americans are more likely to believe that hard work is essential or very important in getting ahead in those first 3 bars on the left relative to the international median. However, what we see on the right is that Americans are also in higher numbers likely to say that these structural factors are essential or very important in getting ahead, such as having educated parents, coming from a wealthy family, and knowing the right people. And you'll notice that there are larger numbers of Americans in the public that say that these structural factors are important, larger than the top 1%. And this is important because it's often said that Americans think like the rich because they want to be like the rich. But here we see very clear differences between the public at large and the top 1%. And then, as I said, more structural orientations among Americans than among the median, among other rich countries. In the bottom right, I have Great Britain, the numbers for Great Britain. You see that Great Britain is about at the median. That's a country that I think is most comparable to the US. Unfortunately, Canada did not field a survey with these data, so I can't compare the US to Canada, which is even closer. But you'll see that even relative to Great Britain, another Anglo country, the US, Americans tend to have more of a structural orientation about barriers to getting ahead than Britons do. Okay, in the next graph, next slide, these are the figures for Chile and then for the median for all countries. So the first gray bar that I showed you in the previous slide was just for the rich countries, and then I've added all countries, so you see the median there, and then I've added Chile as well. You can see that Chile is about at the average, at the median for all countries in terms of the perceptions of hard work or individualism. So not high, not low. But then when it comes to the structural perceptions, you see that Chileans are above the median in terms of their structural orientations as well, and above Americans as well, slightly above. In some cases, about the same in others, but generally comparable. It seems especially that knowing the right people appears to be especially important, or considered especially important in Chile. So in Chile, you see that while they're at the median for individualism, they're on the higher end for structural orientations, which means that you can think about these two as not polar opposites. You either think that there's individuals are responsible, or you think that structures are responsible, but you can actually have both, and I think that's the case in the US as well. Okay, so the next slide That was showing you international data. And these are the results from the survey experiments in the United States. And so in the gray bars, you have the individuals who receive the control information about baseball statistics. And then in the black, blue, and in red bars, you have the people who receive information about inequality. And the difference in the colors is that in the black bar, those are responses in the treatment to the question about how important individualistic factors like hard work and ambition are. And then in blue are the factors that are in a question that are related to high class status, so coming from a wealthy family and having educated parents. And then in red, you see responses in the treatment to the question about structurally disadvantaged groups, so a person's race on the far right and being born a man or a woman. And these are the way the questions are worded in the International Social Survey program. So we did not design these questions. And so what you'll see is that in the treatment, fewer people, the responses about the importance of hard work and ambition and getting ahead is lower in the treatment, people who read inequality, statistically significantly so. And then the structural responses, the importance of coming from a wealthy family and having well-educated parents is higher, and also the perception that gender and race are important is also higher, statistically speaking. So that is, people who read about economic inequality lower their perceptions of the importance of individualism and increase their perceptions of structural barriers to getting ahead. But there are problems with these questions. They're very widely used, not as widely used as you would think, but they're widely used, and when we were using them, we came across this pretty fundamental problem, which we should have realized before the last round of social inequality module questions was surveyed. This is the 2019 to 2021, and that is that when you say being born a man or a woman, if people say that being born a man or a woman is very important or essential in getting ahead, you could be saying that it's men who are disadvantaged rather than women who are disadvantaged. Now, obviously, the people who constructed these questions thought that the responses would go along the lines that you would think, so that gender is important because women are more structurally disadvantaged than men. Same thing with race, a person's race. Whites in the US could say that it's whites who are disadvantaged by being white relative to black or brown people. So again, this was not the intention of those who worded these questions, but we could not disentangle that conflation within the questions within our survey. And it's important because there's a lot of discussion about white backlash and the fact that whites believe that they are subject to discrimination as a result of affirmative action policies, for example. We do not indicate, we cannot tell the difference of whether or not that is occurring with these questions. Okay, so the next slide. So these are surveys that then we conducted ourselves, again, same as these ones, same as the surveys that I just showed you in that graph. We conducted ourselves as well, but we took the questions from the ISSP. These are new surveys that we conducted ourselves in the US, and we created this new question. So we asked, to what extent do the following groups have advantages and opportunities in getting ahead? And then we asked a separate question for people who come from high-income families. That's on the far left, and this is just the control group now. And then men, women, Asians, men, whites, Asians, women, blacks, Latinx individuals, and people who come from low-income countries. We used Hispanic in the actual wording of the questions. And what you see here is the responses in the control group, and what they indicate is this, what we're calling a perceived social structure of economic opportunity. And it's a hierarchy of perceived advantages. And it actually seems remarkably accurate. So people who come from high-income families are considered to have high level of advantages. People who come from low-income families on the right end are considered to have a low level of advantages. And then you have this hierarchy from men, whites, Asians, women, blacks, and Latinx individuals, in a fairly realistic hierarchy of perceived advantage and disadvantage across these groups. So this, we argue, is contrary to a level playing field ideology. If there was a level playing field ideology, then everyone would have equal access and therefore equal advantages for getting ahead. And as you can see, we are now able to disaggregate across the different class, gender, and racial groups, and we see that men and whites and high-income people are perceived to have the highest status. Okay, so then if we go to the next, and then these are the treatment groups, in which we have, again, in red, the structurally disadvantaged groups, and in blue, the structurally advantaged groups. I can talk about Asians. They're a little bit in the middle in the US, but we group them with the higher status structurally advantaged groups. We don't see statistically significant differences in terms of perceptions of structural advantage in the blue bars. Those are the same as in control. But for the structurally disadvantaged groups in the red bars, we do see statistically significant differences in the treatment, which indicate that people think that these structurally disadvantaged groups have even fewer advantages. This is where we talk about, and we're doing further work now where we're actually going to test some of the things I'm about to say. But what we're seeing here is not that with information about high levels of economic inequality that people are perceiving that people from lower class or economically disadvantaged groups are affected negatively by high levels of economic inequality, but actually groups that are disadvantaged by race and gender as well. Race, ethnicity, and gender as well. So that connectedness of the impact of economic inequality on groups based on their class, race, ethnicity, and gender background, we believe is indication of potentially greater cohesion or greater solidarity and connectedness among these groups that are often seen to be divided. And our current work is trying to explore feelings of solidarity across groups more explicitly. Okay, so I want to turn now to the second part. I've talked about how I don't think that we have evidence of that people believe in a level playing field, and that exposure to high levels of economic inequality increases the structural perceptions of shared disadvantage as a result of economic inequality. Now I'm going to, and we have also examined the extent to which the inequality treatment increases or decreases support for government redistribution, and also the type of redistribution I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is in the private sector, labor market redistribution, and we do see a significant effect. The inequality treatment does lead to higher levels of support for government redistribution and for the type of labor market redistribution I'm going to talk about now. But I want to just focus not on the experimental work, but on a new question that we fielded in the International Social Survey program to try to get at this preference for greater economic opportunity in the labor market through reducing inequality in pay between the top and the bottom. So this builds on work that I'm not going to present, but that we have published recently, and that does indicate that there's even higher support among Americans for reducing pay between executives and workers than there is for the government to reduce income between those with high income and those with low income. So sorry I don't have time to go over that, but I'm going to focus on one particular question that we fielded in the most recent round of the ISSP. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the framework that we're using and that's motivating this new question that I'm going to be talking about in just a minute. And I have this quadrant here on the bottom right circled because most of the research focuses on policy preferences related to government redistribution or government programs of various kinds. So our prior work focused a lot on, and still does focus a lot on people's support, maybe not for a question that asked directly about government redistribution by increasing taxes on the rich and increasing transfers to the poor, but by increasing spending on education, for example, or social insurance. Pensions, I know, are a very important issue here, as is education in Chile. So you could look at support for, in the US, for example, support for social insurance programs like government pensions is extremely high, even though if you ask a very generic question about government redistributing income from the rich to the poor, there's low support in the US. So a lot of our work has been, prior work has been trying to show that there is support for government interventions to reduce inequality, but maybe not through this generic question. But social insurance is very, support for social insurance policies and for education are very high. But I'm not going to talk about that today. If we jump to the next slide, this is an area in which the government is still the actor, but the main policies focus on reducing inequality in pay in the labor market. So for example, minimum wages, increasing minimum wages, or the regulation of executive pay, anti-discrimination law. So these are all, the agent is the government, a public sector actor, but the policies and the regulations focus on reducing inequality within the market. So that would be reducing inequality in labor market income, which is in that top row. And then in the next slide, and there's a lot of support. There are individual polls that show that support for those things are very high in the US. Even in Republican states, there's a lot of support for increasing the minimum wage, which is not done at the legislature, but is often done through a state-level referendum. This is what I'm going to focus on here, which is the extent to which people think that private actors, major companies, should be responsible for reducing inequality in pay. I'll also, there are a number of other questions that we're looking at, which is support for unions as well, capping executive pay, and so on. But I'm going to talk about a pretty generic question that we've developed in order to get at this. And I will be referring to this in some respects as labor market redistribution, which is the counterpart to government redistribution through the tax and transfer system. Okay, next graph, please. So I just have a few of these to go through, and then I will be able to wrap up shortly. This is the main question I'm going to focus on here. As I said, there are a lot of other questions, but this is the main one that I want to focus on here. And what we did is we fielded this originally in the US in one of the survey experiments that I showed you earlier, but then we were able to get it on the ISSP, this last round of the International Social Survey Program, which is fielded in 29 countries, so I'll show you the results for that. And what we asked is which of these organizations or which of these groups do you think have the greatest responsibility for reducing differences in income between people with high income and people with low income? And these are the 6 answers that are available. In our original research, we randomized the order except for the last one that says that income differences do not need to be reduced. So what we're trying to do here, actually, if you could jump to the next slide. What we're trying to do here is to understand whether or not so the people who respond that they don't think government should be responsible for reducing inequality, that they don't seem to support high levels of government redistribution, the assumption is that then they think that inequality doesn't need to be reduced, that they're tolerant of inequality. And this is where the anti-government and free market ideology come into play. So if people don't respond, the government has this responsibility in high numbers, people don't respond, then the assumption is that people are not only anti-government, but they're also pro-free market. So that stance, by definition, means that people believe that market inequalities are fair and that inequality doesn't need to be reduced. So this is what we're trying to test with this question. To what extent do people, if they don't think government is responsible primarily responsible for reducing inequality? Do they think that other institutions, such as market institutions, unions, or private companies, and I've also included here high-income individuals themselves, maybe those groups are seen as responsible? Or is it, as people think, that in the light gray, that income differences, people don't think income differences need to be reduced, or they blame individuals? So this would be an individualistic, individual responsibility response, that low-income individuals themselves are responsible for their low economic status. So next slide, please. So here are the results. This is the share that said the government is the most responsible group. And you'll see that the US is on the far left. So it is the outlier that we expected it to be, and that it always is when in response to questions like this. And you'll see that Chile has a very high, I think it's 70% in Chile say the government is the most responsible for reducing inequality among those groups. And I will talk about Chile in a moment in another graph, but I'm going to go through these next few graphs pretty quickly to show you that, great, thank you, that once we add these other alternative market institutions, so I've got them all in red now, so high-income people, private companies, business, and unions all together, that's the red bar. You can see what a difference this makes in the case of the US. And for some other countries, such as Switzerland, Switzerland does a lot of work, national ballots around reducing executive pay, for example. There's a lot, and also the role of banks. And so that is interesting as well. In France, you also see a large share of people who are identifying with this alternative institutions for reducing inequality. So you can see that when we combine all three together, it's about the same or more, or a larger share in the US think that those are responsible, those groups are responsible for reducing inequality. And then lastly, in the next slide, you can see the light gray. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but that's the residual. That's what most people thought would make up even the red part, right? These are the people who blame low-income individuals and who think that reducing income inequality isn't important, right? So they're tolerant of inequality. That's actually a very small share of people everywhere, including in the US. And then in the next slide, there we go. So I've broken it down into the red bar is now broken down into the three separate groups, and the red bar is generally higher, so that's private companies. Certainly in the US that's the case, in Switzerland. But you could see, for example, in Denmark how important unions are. And in Chile, it's mostly about private companies. The red part of the bar is greater than the part that has to do with unions, which is the second largest share. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this is going to be the last one of this section, then I can jump to the conclusion, which has to do with politics, the political sphere, as I mentioned earlier. So this, I'm just going to talk about the right-hand side graph here. I have Chile circled. The US is more towards the kind of arrow. If you think about the line, the gray line is the share of people in each of these countries that pick the government option. The red line is the share in each of these countries that picked private companies, unions, or high-income people as the most important. And then the gray line, I don't know if you can see that, are the share of people who picked low-income individuals, and income inequality doesn't need to be reduced. And what you can see is that and on the x-axis is what's called a free market index. We take this from conservative organizations, the Fraser Institute, the Heritage Foundation. They rank all these countries in terms of their lack of regulations, lack of government regulations, an environment that's friendly to business. And you'll see that Chile is towards the right. Not all the way to the right. The US is farther to the right on this in terms of this ranking. And as you are identified as being more open to free market policies, There are fewer people who say the government is most responsible, probably not surprising. But what we see, and Chile is even above what you would expect in this regard. So given where its status is as identified as a free market country, there's a larger share of people who say the government is most responsible in Chile relative to the average of what you would expect across all these countries. But what is counterintuitive here is the increase, the positive slope in the red line. That means that as countries are ranked as being more and more open to business and business friendly and having fewer regulations of the market, there's actually more people who identify the private sector and these alternative market institutions as responsible for reducing inequality. You would think the opposite. You think that and the argument is often made, that as countries become more and more free market oriented, more and more neoliberal, that then the public is going to become more and more neoliberal and more market oriented. But we see the opposite here. Yes, a lack of focus on on the government, that's one way of interpreting it, but also greater responsibility for corporations. And we have further data that suggests that this is real. That red mark is real. People do support, Chile especially, very high support for policies such as a higher minimum wage, representation of workers on the board, curbing executive pay. There's a high agreement on all of these factors. So this is not just people saying this, but also supporting certain kinds of policies. Okay, so let me wrap up. Actually, the next slide, then the next slide, I'm going to skip that. Okay, and very quickly, the next slide. This is just one last graph before my conclusion. So this is the political sphere. So the work of COES and others has really focused on, in addition to conflict and cohesion, or in relation to cohesion and conflict, also about the role of trust, that is implicated in whether or not a society has high levels of conflict or high levels of cohesion. And Chile is surprisingly about at the median here. I expected it to be a little higher. The US is the red bar to the right. So the US, relative to other Anglo countries, tends to have less trust in government. But I want to emphasize that we also have data showing that Americans have very little trust in corporations as well. I can talk about that more in the Q&A. And in Chile, it's about at the median in terms of trusting the perception that government cares about reducing inequality. There are other measures I could use, but this is just one that was in the ISSP. So there's a lack of political trust that I think could be associated with the lack of support for government redistribution, maybe a little bit less so in the Chilean case. Okay, so concluding. Sorry, I've gone over. Next slide. Okay, so obviously I've been trying to question certain aspects of American exceptionalism that have to do with people's belief in or tolerance of economic inequality and belief that there's equality of opportunity for everyone, regardless of their class, race, or gender. And also questioning the extent to which people hold free market views in which there should be no interventions in the private economy that are not profit maximizing interventions. So clearly, social interventions that would reduce the pay of executives, for example, or increase the pay of unskilled workers is not considered a profit maximizing necessarily strategy. So that is why it violates principles of free market ideology. The alternative explanation for high levels of inequality, if it's not because Americans want it or believe that there are benefits, great benefits of inequality, would be a more of an institutional explanation, and that's the failure of political institutions to better represent the public interest. And in the US case, I'm talking here about political parties, but also the Constitution. I mean, this is what is, to me, this is something that's extremely important, is that our Constitution is deeply undemocratic. I wish we could have the opportunity to change our Constitution. But through the Senate, the Electoral College, the Supreme Court, these are all deeply, deeply undemocratic institutions, and they're all rooted in the Constitution. And so we have a lack of political representation. I think that this is not the work I do myself, but the lack of support in the Congress, in the US Congress, for policies that are very, very popular. And this includes intervention in the market through things like increasing the minimum wage to a level that's much higher than it is currently. But also we see very high support for representation of workers on boards and so on. So what I say here in red is that in the US, and this is where my thoughts have really evolved since the last time I was here, in the US there's a lot less emphasis now on which policy, is the most important policy for reducing inequality. And much more emphasis on the lack of political representation and the lack of political power. So that it's political inequality itself that is the barrier to reducing inequality. It's the lack of political power that people have, that the great majority of people don't have, that want to see less economic inequality, whether through government programs of social insurance or in the market itself. So that's why I think there's been a real shift to the political sphere and the importance of politics. And then finally, a multidimensional framework that I try to suggest in which we can think about general support around policies that reduce economic inequality in the labor market, that increase economic justice, that increase inclusiveness within the economy across gender, race, and class. And I will end there. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for going over. Should I take questions? I'm going to step out of the light for a second. Should I take questions? Hi.
So we can sit down over there.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I have some comments for you.
Oh, great.
And then we can open up to the public.
Excellent.
Sounds good?
Yes, thank you. Let me just grab my water. Here.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Buenos días. Mi nombre es Matías Barksted, investigador asociado al COES, y me voy a pasar al inglés. So, the plan is to provide you some comments that I came up with after reading your work. I read a couple of articles that you sent me, and I was hoping that these comments can, are basically my reactions, like to what the readings. So perhaps they could be useful, highlighting new roads for further research and things ahead. But I don't want to talk all the time, so I'm hoping that I'll be brief, and we can talk about it later if we need, and we can open up to questions from the public. So until what time do we have? ¿Hasta qué hora tenemos? 10:30? 10:30. So we have 15 minutes. So do we have much time? So I'm going to be extremely brief then, okay? So we can talk about it later, okay? So I actually have 3 sets of comments. I'm going to be really, really brief, okay? So one key or cornerstone of your research, which by the way is fascinating, I was very engaged with it, is the information treatment about inequality. Providing people a realistic, objective, but brief piece of information about inequality and what reaction does that have, to which we look at the factors that people give more or less importance to get ahead in life, and whether are structural factors and delicious factors. So reading that, made me think about all this literature about public opinion research about belief updating models, you know, the Bayesian rational updating, rational bias updating versus a more motivated reasoning kind of model. It would be really interesting, and we can talk about it much more later, I got a couple ideas, but to connect that literature with what would be the underlying updating model that you're working on, you know, when you provide people an information treatment about inequality. Why does it trigger a more structuralist view towards the importance of key factors getting ahead versus the individualist factors? And the kind of ramifications are pretty important, you know, because of if people are trying to, you know, stubbornly resist that kind of information, there's less so perhaps space in the future for consensus building on the kinds of things that need, the kind of policy that we would actually adopt to pass through, you know, equality enhancing measures from in legislation, as opposed to a rational updating model where people are like kind of, you know, I don't like it, but eventually I just, you know, give in because the information is pretty consistent. That said then, there's also an interesting implicit kind of zero-sum game between the individualistic factors versus the structuralist factors. So Leslie didn't present one of her fascinating pieces of results in the PNES article of 2017, but there she does, with her co-author, a study where she shows that if people receive the treatment information, and after they receive an American Dream treatment information, they kind of become more willing relative to a control group to give more importance to both individualistic and structuralist factors. That's really a fascinating piece because it kind of opens up, you know, this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, you know, or not a single-dimensional kind of thing. You know, people can actually go both ways as conditioned on the kind of information they receive. And that also, I think, is a kind of clue that this might be more about rational updating than actually resisting your previous beliefs. And lastly, to open up to the public, there's another piece of fascinating information, results, empirical results that weren't shown here, but I actually wanted to highlight them. So in your work, in the socioeconomic review article from last year, you guys find that trust in the market is even more predictive of support for equality enhancing measures than support than trust in the government. That blew my mind, actually. How powerful is labor market is the perception of the market as a efficient, fair, distributive mechanism really plays out a powerful role. And actually, I haven't seen that much in all the literature, which I follow pretty closely about political trust, institutional trust, trust in the market. There's something there very special that perhaps you could, you know, talk a little about it. So we can talk about a little more. I got comments already and all that. But perhaps you can address the last point, and then we'll open up to the public.
Sure. Is this working? I think it is. Yeah. Thank you so much for those comments. They're excellent. And definitely things that I'm thinking about in terms of the mechanisms that might help explain the results, which we haven't gotten into very deeply. But I think that your points are very well taken about the updating. And to a certain extent, there is a lot of discussion around that. So we can talk about that maybe later, and I'll address the trust in market. So the important finding there, we were also surprised. I want to emphasize that Americans are distrustful of corporations too. So not as distrustful as they are of government, but still well below average. You know, they're not even in the midpoint of the scale for trust in market institutions and private government. They're below the midpoint of the scale, and they're much less trusting of government, much less trusting of both government and market institutions than the two other countries, people in the two other countries that we studied, which is Denmark and Sweden. So that's another strike against the free market ideology idea that Americans have, and that by definition, if you do not support government programs, then you must be pro-free market, right? Those two do not go together. They're conflated, but there isn't, as you say, much or really any research on this. So what we find, I think I'll just say this one thing. What we find, and we did not put in that paper, unfortunately, I wish we had, but what we find is that it's only the intersection of high-income people and conservative ideology Republicans. It's only the high-income conservative Republicans who have high trust in private companies. They have high trust in private companies and low support for redistribution by the government or by private companies. So we're talking the majority of Democrats, of independents, of people throughout the rest of the distribution who are not high income. All of those people have low trust in market institutions and high support, or relatively high support, for government and market institutions to reduce inequality. So I think that, so to put it a slightly different way, is that you can distrust the market, but still want it to implement inequality-reducing policies, right? So, and the contrast would be that you distrust government, but you don't want it to impact, you don't want it to engage in reducing inequality. I think that's a little bit, I wouldn't go that far, because like I said, there's very high support for government policies around social insurance, for example. So if that's enough, I think, to say on that point. We can definitely talk further about both of your points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can open up to questions from the public. Si es que prefiere preguntar en castellano, yo me ofrezco de traductor espontáneo. Tenemos una pregunta ahí. Hay traductor, la profesora está con traductor, así que si es que quieren preguntar en español.
En inglés ni un problema.
Como quiera.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor McCall. Thought it was a fascinating talk. I just have one question in particular. I remember seeing one of the graphs, I think it was the variable on on having wealthy parents, I believe. And I think the answers of the importance of getting ahead, that was how it was framed, right, the question? I believe the top 1% of the US would say, only 1% of the top 1% of the US would say that having wealthy parents would actually help you get ahead, which I found fascinating because there was, assemblies, or at least a bit of like, at least acknowledgement of structural factors within that top 1% in the other variables, not particularly in that one. I thought that was fascinating. I thought we could interrogate that a bit more, especially thinking of, obviously, Piketty, and thinking in particular also that, on the one hand, maybe the question could have been interpreted as meaning, by wealthy, you could mean either high income or actually wealthy in terms of wealth. And at the same time, the top 1% of, I presume, Ben Page measured income, I guess, but the top 1% might have been both of income and wealth. Nevertheless, perhaps there are interesting and important differences of attitudes to inequality when it comes to wealth inequality or income inequality. Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta por ahí?
Hola, ahí sí. Ahí sí se escucha, ¿verdad? Okay. I have two very brief questions. I love the presentation, by the way. It was very, very interesting. The first is when you unpack these three spheres, I wonder why social services, social insurance were considered like economic and not social. Why was that decision taken? And also if the dynamics of social services and social insurance might be different in the sense that, I don't know, universal services like education or health might be quite different from social policies targeting to the poor, the undeserving poor, which has a different connotation. And then the other question is whether or not in your work you have incorporated an intersectional type of view. whether people consider that different social groups are discriminated against, but it might be quite different to be an African American woman poor than African American, period. So this combination of, race, social class, gender, and so on. So.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a specific question regarding this perception of a structural advantage, getting ahead. Did you test any breakdown by the actual gender, ethnicity? And you all the time made me think about other theories in social psychology. One of your neighbor researcher, John Jost, we're working a lot on system justification. So specifically coming from those more deprived groups who justify these inequalities in different domains. So I was really curious seeing if, when you look at the perception that women or men are seeing them as an in-group or an out-group differently as responsible for this advantage, structural. So just give us a thought if you have done, maybe it's a three-way interaction, maybe it's too much in the data, but I think it's worth looking at these differences.
Great, thank you so much. I think these are all fantastic questions. And I'm just gonna very briefly respond because we only have a few minutes, right? Okay. So the first question, thank you for that observation. I normally point that out actually, but I was running out of time. And the one thing that I do often say is that I actually don't usually make the comparison like you did, which I think is really interesting, that question specifically is very low. Even though they're low across the structural barriers, right? That one is especially low. And that 1% is actually one person. Because the survey itself was only 100 people. It was a representative survey. It was very, very expensive to field. It was a representative survey by Benjamin Page, who was a colleague of mine at the time at Northwestern University, so I was able to get these questions on the survey. But it's very expensive to survey. These were top 1 to 2% of wealth holders in the Chicago area, but representative. So very expensive to survey those people. So it ended up just being 100 people, and so only one of them mentioned that coming from a wealthy family was important. Maybe it has to do with the income versus wealth. I'm not sure. That's a really good point. But I looked at their background, and they're not from disproportionately poor background, right? You'd think that because they themselves didn't come from a wealthy background, that they wouldn't think that was, but they don't. They come from mostly professional backgrounds. But you're right. Maybe they don't consider that wealthy. I think that's a really interesting point. In terms of the other policies, absolutely. I've spent a lot of time trying to talk about the difference between social services versus social insurance. I would put education in the social services, right? And then social insurance, obviously, for unemployment, for old age insurance, sickness to a certain extent. And I see that as all part of more of a social investment model. And I think that social investment model is extremely popular. In most places, I think that's the case. Versus an explicitly redistributive approach, which may not be, so to take the US as an example, the support for an explicitly redistributive government redistribution type of question, you have very low support for that. But if you ask people, should taxes on the rich be increased, you have very high support for that, right? So you have to be very careful with these questions. And I've spent a lot of time working with them in exactly the way that you've identified. So I take your point for sure. But there's still a lot of work on that. So the other point that I'm trying to make is that there's still, all of the research focuses on public opinion about those government policies that affect disposable income inequality, but not about the private, generally not even about the government regulation of the market, let alone market practices themselves. In terms of intersectionality, we, as I mentioned, we're improving upon, we think, significantly improving upon what is currently best practice with the ISSP, which is those questions about being born a man or a woman and a person's race. So you can imagine like how aggregated that is. And so we disaggregated to the 8 groups that we came up with, but no, unfortunately, we have not yet done an intersectional. We're still working on the extent to which people have, we're in the field right now. In fact, we're awaiting the data. Probably on Friday we'll get the data, because we're asking questions about whether or not people feel that low-income people need to connect with other groups that are also disadvantaged in order to create policies that will reduce inequality. Things like that are solidaristic types of questions. That's where we're focusing right now rather than disaggregating further, but I think eventually we will disaggregate further. And then finally, yes, we only broke out, so a really important discussion in the US has to do with the backlash, particularly among white, non-college educated people in the US. These are people who are disproportionately likely to support Donald Trump. And there's a lot of white nationalism, for sure, and supremacy in those views, anti-immigration, but also a kind of economic market populism. So it's a complicated group. So we've only, since there's been so much emphasis on that, we've only looked at that group in terms of their responses to these questions, and we find that their responses are the same as the general responses. Now, it's underpowered. We're doing a new survey. As part of this survey, we actually have a 2,000 sample size for just the white non-college educated group. We'll be able to have a powered test of that, but we don't have that yet. But we're not, I checked a little bit for the gender differences, the racial differences. I'm not seeing a big difference among them, but I think we're underpowered for those tests, and it's something we would like to do and engage in further. But, you know, sort of like the response to the other question, very important extensions of this work. We're kind of going baby step by baby step with this work because there hasn't been this attempt to connect the class and the racial and the gender groups together. We need to go further for intersectional, and then we need to look at how individual groups themselves view these structural orientations. So, all great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McCall. Estamos pasado ya es la hora, así que hora del cafecito. Nos vemos afuera. Muchas gracias por venir.
Y Leslie McCall, la profesora Leslie McCall, como decía Matías, nos vamos a trasladar en un segundo al edificio Patio Alameda y vamos a estar acompañados de nuestra 10ª conferencia anual. Y por supuesto a cada uno y cada una de las personas que ha formado este centro durante estos 10 años. Y simplemente saludar la buena noticia que recibimos ayer respecto de, todavía tiene que pasar por la Contraloría, así que no, pero, ya pasó, ¡ay, excelente! Bueno. Entonces, excelentes noticias para tener una muy buena jornada, 3 días de trabajo y bueno, con mucha alegría entonces sigamos conversando en el coffee enfrente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.